Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest stories. The office at Caldwell and Wright was quiet by 6:45 p.m., the kind of silence only fluorescent lights and exhausted ambition could fill. Caroline Walker sat alone in the shared executive suite, her reading glasses perched low on her nose as she combed through one last compliance report. At 54, she was known for her precision, meticulous, organized, unshakable. The kind of woman who never missed a deadline or left dishes in the break room sink. Her colleagues respected her. Some feared her, but few truly knew her. That was fine by Caroline. Routine had become her sanctuary. Morning tea, emails by 8:10, a silent lunch at her desk, and the quiet hum of her printer long after most of the office had gone home. It was predictable, safe. A life of careful rhythms and soft, controlled silences. She had no idea that tonight would break that rhythm. As she moved to return a file to Director Reeves' office, a simple handoff, nothing more, she noticed it, a cream-colored envelope sitting neatly on the corner of his otherwise spotless desk. It was sealed, heavy paper, elegant, deliberate, and it had her name on it. Caroline froze. Caroline, not Ms. Walker. Not to compliance. Not even her initials. Just her first name, handwritten in smooth, looping ink she recognized instantly as Jonathan Reeves. Her heartbeat stuttered. She glanced around the empty hallway before stepping fully inside, as if expecting to be caught doing something wrong. But this wasn't hidden. It was placed intentionally, right where she'd find it. She hesitated only a moment before picking it up. The envelope felt heavier than it should have. She didn't open it until she was back at her own desk. She sat down slowly, the report now forgotten. Her hands, steady moments before, trembled as she slipped her finger under the flap and opened the letter. It wasn't typed. It was handwritten. Her eyes scanned the opening line. Caroline, I've rewritten this more times than I'll admit, but I've decided that words only matter when they're allowed to be true. So I'll let this be true, even if it's quiet. Asterisk. Her throat tightened. You once told me, over coffee in the conference room, that silence is a kind of safety. But I think you've used it like armor. And I've watched you wear it every day, beautifully, even when I wished you'd let someone see underneath. Caroline blinked hard. The memory that conversation had been years ago. She barely remembered saying it, but he had remembered. This isn't about love. Not the kind that demands or takes. It's about presence, respect, admiration. It's about how deeply I've noticed you, your stillness, your strength, the grace with which you carry invisible weight. I see it. I've always seen it. She stopped reading. For a moment, everything in her mind went blank. The office noise, the hum of electricity, the distant elevator bell, the soft thump of her own pulse. All of it faded into silence. This wasn't a love letter. Not in the traditional sense. It was something rarer. It was a recognition. And in a life built on being useful, efficient, composed, being seen felt like a revolution. She read the rest slowly, absorbing every word like a foreign language she didn't realize she could understand. No signature. Just his initials. J.R. Caroline folded the letter with careful hands. She placed it back into the envelope and tucked it into the back of her drawer, behind a box of paper clips and an unopened stress ball from last year's HR retreat. Then she turned off her lamp, gathered her things, and walked out into the night air a little colder, a little more alive. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel invisible. Caroline didn't sleep well that night. She had gone through her usual motions, chamomile tea, a quick glance at the crossword, a last-minute scan of her calendar for the next day. But her mind kept drifting back to the letter. The handwriting, the phrasing, the intimacy. She lay in bed with the lights off, staring at the ceiling, listening to the familiar hum of her bedside clock. Her body was still, but her thoughts churned. She knew what she had read. Every word had been deliberate, not romantic, not inappropriate, but deeply personal, respectful, emotional. It was the kind of message that stripped away the safety of silence and left something raw in its place. What unsettled her most wasn't what Jonathan had written. It was how much she had wanted to read it again. At the office the next morning, everything looked the same. Jonathan Reeves' door was open as usual. His posture behind the desk was as straight as ever, his expression calm, unflinching. He greeted her with a polite nod as she passed his office on her way to her own. Not a single flicker of tension. If he was nervous about what he'd done, he didn't show it. And that made her feel even more unsteady. She tried to focus. Emails, spreadsheets, policy updates, she buried herself in them. She even volunteered to help revise a document that wasn't due for another week. Anything to keep her hands busy and her mind anchored. But then, around noon, she saw it. Jonathan stood by the coffee station, pouring his tea. He stirred it absently, then glanced up, and their eyes met. It was just a second, but it was enough. He didn't smile. He didn't look away. He simply held her gaze, like someone who already knew what he'd said and wasn't afraid of the weight it carried. Caroline looked down, her breath catching. She turned away and returned to her desk. That night, she took the letter out of the drawer again. She read it slowly, deliberately. Not to decode it, but to sit with it. Let it breathe. Something inside her stirred. Not excitement, not panic, something quieter. Longing. Not for Jonathan, but for this version of herself he had written about. The woman who was seen. She couldn't remember the last time someone described her like that. Not as useful, efficient, dependable, but as present. As a person of depth. She thought of her ex-husband, Mark. How many years they'd spent together in a polite fog. They hadn't fought. They hadn't been cruel. They had just stopped noticing each other. The divorce had been clean. And that, somehow, had been the saddest part. By the time the next morning arrived, she had made a decision. She wasn't going to pretend the letter didn't exist. But she wasn't going to confront him with it like a scandal either. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't an offense. It was a gift. And she owed him, and herself, the honesty of acknowledgement. That afternoon, she walked by his office. He looked up, and before he could speak, she stepped just inside the doorway. "Do you have a moment?" she asked. Jonathan nodded, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "Of course." She sat, folded her hands in her lap, and looked at him, steady, but gentle. "I got your letter." A quiet beat passed. He didn't flinch. He simply nodded. "I thought you might." Caroline tilted her head slightly. "You weren't planning to mention it?" "No," he said calmly. "I left it knowing you had the right to choose what it meant to you. I wasn't expecting anything in return." She exhaled slowly. "I appreciate that." Jonathan leaned back in his chair, his voice quiet. "I just wanted to tell the truth. That's all." There was no apology in his tone, but no pressure either. Caroline nodded. "Well," she said, rising from her chair, "thank you for being brave enough to say something true." Their eyes met again. This time, something softened between them. Respect. Mutual knowing. And a door just slightly cracked open. By the time Friday arrived, something had shifted in Caroline. It wasn't dramatic. No emotional outburst, no sudden clarity. Just a subtle change in how she moved through her day. She still arrived precisely at 8:15. Still answered her emails with measured care. Still corrected 2 typos in the quarterly compliance brief before anyone else noticed. But something inside her, something long tucked away, had quietly stirred. And Jonathan could feel it too. There was a quietness between them now, but not the strained silence of avoidance. It was the calm that follows truth, fragile, but honest. A thread connecting them, even when they weren't speaking. It wasn't tension. It was attention. That afternoon, as Caroline was organizing end-of-week files, a soft knock landed on her open door. She looked up to see Jonathan leaning in. "Do you have a moment?" She gestured toward the chair in front of her desk. "Of course." He stepped inside, hesitated for a breath, then offered a small folder. "I know this is unusual," he began, "but I was hoping you'd take a look at something." She raised an eyebrow as she took the folder. "Work-related?" "Not exactly." Inside was a printed manuscript, About 15 pages, single-spaced, neatly formatted. No cover page. Just a simple title at the top, The Unspoken Spaces. Her fingers paused on the edge of the paper. "What is this?" she asked, her voice soft. "A personal essay," he said. "Something I wrote last month. About solitude, aging, purpose. And a woman I once knew who reminded me what grace looks like." Caroline's heart stilled. He cleared his throat gently. "I've written pieces before, but never shared them. You're the first person I've felt safe enough to ask." Caroline looked up, studying his face, not for signs of flattery, but for truth. There it was again, not seduction, not pursuit. Presence. She nodded slowly. "I'll read it." "Thank you," he said, already turning to leave. Then paused at the door. "And Caroline," he added, "it's okay if you don't like it, but I hope it reaches you." And then he was gone. That night, she poured a glass of wine, sat at her dining room table, and unfolded the pages. She read slowly, carefully. It wasn't a love letter. It was a meditation, a quiet exploration of how people vanish while still being present, and how stillness, when chosen not forced, can be its own form of power. The essay spoke of a woman who moved through the world unnoticed, but who carried a fire behind her calm. A woman who didn't need recognition, but deserved it anyway. Caroline saw herself in every paragraph, not just who she was now, but who she used to be, before she'd shrunk herself for marriage, before she stopped asking questions for fear of being labeled difficult, before she traded her poetry journals for performance reviews. By the time she reached the final line, she was blinking back tears. And in her silence, I found the echo of my own. She closed the pages gently, her fingertips resting on the cover. No one had written about her like this before. Maybe no one had truly seen her like this before. The next morning, she arrived at the office earlier than usual. The hallway was still quiet, the air fresh with weekend approaching. She stood outside Jonathan's office for a moment, then stepped inside. He wasn't there yet, so she left the folder neatly on his desk, with a note on top. "It reached me. Thank you. Let me know when you're ready to share more. See." Later that day, as she passed him in the hallway, he gave her a small, knowing smile. It wasn't flirtatious. It was grateful, steady. And for the first time in years, she smiled back, not out of politeness, but from something deeper, something awakening. The following week unfolded gently, like petals opening after a long frost. There was no dramatic shift between Caroline and Jonathan. They didn't start having lunch together. They didn't exchange long stares over office reports. What grew between them was something subtler, something rooted, a quiet understanding. But something was undeniably different, and not just between them. Something had shifted within Caroline. It was in how she paused during her walks to notice light filtering through trees. How she reread a favorite novel she hadn't touched in years. How, on a whim, she pulled an old sketchpad from the back of her closet, surprised to find a few untouched pages. She had loved drawing once. Back when she was still Caroline Whitaker, before she married Mark Walker. Back when she signed her name with a little flourish at the end and believed art didn't have to be practical. That version of her had been buried for so long, she barely remembered how it felt to create without needing permission. On Thursday afternoon, as the last emails of the day trickled in, Jonathan appeared at her door again, this time with a different kind of question. "Do you have plans this Saturday morning?" he asked casually. She looked up from her monitor, curious. "Not yet." "Why?" He hesitated for just a beat. "There's a small writers' gathering at Westbrook Library. Nothing formal, just quiet people reading quietly. I go sometimes. I thought you might like it." Caroline blinked. It wasn't a date. It wasn't flirtation. It was an invitation. To a space. To a version of herself she had been slowly remembering. "I'd like that," she said, surprising herself with how easily the words came. Saturday arrived gray and misty, the kind of morning that smelled like damp leaves and fresh starts. Caroline dressed simply, but thoughtfully. A soft sweater, dark jeans, and a scarf that still held the faint scent of lavender from her closet sachets. She wore a pair of earrings she hadn't touched in years, silver with tiny engraved leaves. Feminine. Subtle. The library was small and tucked into a quiet corner of the city park. A local gem she had passed by 100 times without entering. Jonathan was waiting near the entrance, a paperback tucked under his arm. He smiled when he saw her. "You came." "Of course," she replied. "I told you I would." Inside, the gathering was just as he described, a circle of about 12 people seated in old armchairs, sipping tea, notebooks open. No introductions. No microphones. Just a shared love of words. Caroline chose a seat by the window, light pooling at her feet. Jonathan sat across from her. A woman read a poem about letting go of timelines. A man shared a letter he wrote to his younger self. Someone read a fragment of a novel in progress that made Caroline's chest ache in the best way. And then, without warning, Jonathan stood. He didn't look at her directly, but she knew the piece he pulled from his coat pocket wasn't random. He read softly, clearly, about longing and stillness. About how time doesn't always dull our edges, but softens the places we stopped believing in. About a woman who walked through rooms without asking for attention, and yet changed them just by being in them. He didn't say her name. He didn't have to. Caroline sat still, her throat tight, her hands folded in her lap. When he finished, there was a respectful silence. No applause. Just space. And she realized this was a different kind of seeing. One not meant to flatter or chase, but to honor. Afterward, they walked through the park slowly. "Thank you for inviting me," she said. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he admitted. "I wasn't sure either. Until I realized I missed parts of myself I didn't know were still there." He smiled at that. "You're not the only one." They walked in silence for a while longer, the world soft and slow around them. Then, without thinking, she reached into her bag and pulled out a folded sketch, a quick charcoal drawing she'd done that morning before leaving. Just a tree outside her window, light streaming through the branches. She handed it to him. "I've only shown 3 people my drawings in my life. You're the 4th. Jonathan took it gently, eyes tracing the lines, his expression unreadable, and then deeply moved. "It's beautiful," he said. "No," she replied, "but it's honest." And he nodded, as if that mattered even more. That night, back at home, Caroline didn't put the sketchbook away. She left it out, next to her tea mug, beside a stack of essays. Because some parts of you don't need to be hidden forever. Some parts are just waiting for a reason to begin again. The following week passed like a dream, slow, steady, deceptively calm. Caroline had returned to work with a newfound ease. She walked through the office not just as someone performing a role, but as someone aware of herself again. Her senses were sharper, her voice firmer. Even her wardrobe had shifted slightly, less beige, more color. Small things, but deliberate. And yet, the more she allowed herself to open, the more exposed she began to feel. It wasn't Jonathan who caused it. It was her. On Wednesday afternoon, she caught a few coworkers whispering near the copier, glancing her way when they thought she wasn't looking. She brushed it off, at first. But later, when she passed 2 junior associates near the kitchen, she heard it clearly. "They say she's spending a lot of time with him lately. He's leaving soon anyway, right? Retirement rumors are basically confirmed. Maybe she's just trying to secure a promotion." The last one stung. Not because it was cruel, but because it was dismissive. She wasn't foolish. She knew how offices worked, how women, especially women her age, were either invisible or under scrutiny the moment they stopped blending in. That evening, she stayed late, alone at her desk, the hum of fluorescent lights pressing against her thoughts. Was she being foolish? She had spent so long building this life of dignity, of respect. Had she risked all of that for a connection that might not even last? The memory of Jonathan reading in the library, his voice steady, his words so clearly meant for her, came rushing back. She closed her eyes. It hadn't been about attention, or strategy, or performance. It had been real, and real things make people uncomfortable. That night, she didn't draw, didn't read. She sat in the dark living room, fingers curled around a cold mug of tea, thinking about the version of herself she had just begun to reclaim. Was she strong enough to keep her open heart open, even when the world judged it? The next morning, she found an envelope on her desk, smaller than the first one. Inside was a card, unsealed, with a familiar, looping handwriting. You looked far away yesterday. If you ever want to talk, I'm here.
J.
She read it twice. Then again. She placed it in her drawer without folding it, and then, slowly, walked down the hall to his office. The door was open. He looked up, startled for only a second, before his gaze steadied. Caroline stood in the doorway, calm but clear. "People are talking," she said. Jonathan leaned back, his brow furrowed. "I know. Some of them think I'm doing this for status. Or attention." He nodded, expression unreadable. "And are you?" She almost smiled. "No," she said. "But I'd be lying if I said their voices didn't get into my head." Jonathan rose slowly, came around the desk, and stood in front of her. Not too close, but close enough that she could see the sincerity in his eyes. "Let them talk," he said quietly. "We don't owe anyone a script." She looked at him, this man who had never once tried to impress her, never rushed her, never crossed a line. He simply showed up. Again and again. Caroline exhaled. "I don't want to go backwards," she said. "Then don't," he replied. "Let them say what they want. You've spent long enough living for expectations that were never yours to begin with." She nodded slowly. "Okay," she whispered. A pause. "Then, would you like to take a walk with me after work?" His smile was quiet. "Sure. I'd like that very much." That evening, they walked beneath the trees, the sun beginning its slow descent. There was no performance, no anxiety, just two people moving forward, one step at a time. Caroline didn't care if anyone saw them. Not anymore. Because she wasn't seeking permission. She was claiming something true. It was Jonathan's last official week at Caldwell and Wright. The announcement had gone out that Monday, a dignified, well-worded internal memo. After more than 18 years of exceptional leadership, Jonathan Reeve will be retiring at the end of the quarter to pursue personal creative projects. There were polite emails. A few printed cards signed by different departments. The office buzzed with casual goodbyes, mostly surface level. Caroline kept her reaction private. They hadn't defined anything between them. There was no label, no resolution. But there was something. Something living in the spaces between coffee cups, long walks, and the folded letter still sitting in her drawer. On his final day, the firm held a small send-off in the conference room. There were cupcakes, a few speeches, light laughter. Jonathan gave a short, gracious thank you and spoke about gratitude, change, and honoring your inner voice even when it whispers. Some clapped. Some checked their watches. Caroline stayed at the back of the room, quiet, observant. Their eyes met only once. But that one look said everything. This isn't an ending. After the celebration, the office cleared quickly. Caroline lingered. When she finally made her way to Jonathan's office, the door was already half open. He stood by the window, a small box of personal items by his side. A few framed photos. A leather notebook. One navy blue mug she recognized from their many late work nights. He turned when he saw her and smiled. Tired but full. "You stayed," he said softly. "Of course." They stood there for a long moment, the weight of transition thick in the air. "You're really leaving," she said. He nodded. "I think it's time. Do you know what's next?" Jonathan's smile turned wry. "Not exactly. But I think I'm finally ready to find out." She stepped closer. "And what about this?" she asked. "Whatever this has been between us?" He studied her face for a long time. Not with hesitation, but with care. "I think that's not for the office to decide," he said. "Or a calendar. Or a title. Then who decides?" "We do," he said. "If we want it." She exhaled slowly. "I do," she said. His shoulders relaxed, just slightly, as if he'd been holding that breath for weeks. "Then let's not rush it," he said. "Let's let it unfold like it always has, gently. On our own terms." She smiled, eyes misting just a little. No declarations? No declarations, he said, chuckling. But maybe a walk this Saturday? Same park. Same quiet bench. I'll be there, she said. As they walked out together, not hand in hand, but side by side, Caroline felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. Not the youthful, reckless kind, but the mature, grounded kind that says, you are allowed to begin again. You are allowed to be seen. You are allowed to choose softness after a lifetime of strength. That weekend, they met beneath the old oak tree in the park. No plans. No promises. Just two people choosing presence. And for Caroline, that was more than enough. Because not every story ends with fireworks. Some end with peace. And sometimes, that's the most beautiful ending of all.